Welcome everybody to the May 10th meeting of the Sacramento SMPTE chapter. A note to everybody that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the website. Our presentation today is from SDI to IP while the airplane's in flight. It's a discussion of the migration of Microsoft Studios from SDI to an IP infrastructure while the SDI Studio was still being used as an SDI Studio. Our presenter will be Karl Paulsen. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Diversified. And in addition to being the CTO, he's also their project architect and advisor/consultant. Before we start, just a brief reminder of the SMPTE board for our Sacramento section. The chair is myself, Paul Turner. Our secretary and treasurer is Mona Smothers, without whom none of this would be possible. And our section managers are Bob Huddleston, Tim Walker, Patty Leonard, John Henkel, and Robert Erickson. As a reminder of the capabilities available to you as a member, you have access to the Motion Imaging Journal, which is our flagship publication, consistently ranked as the most valuable benefit for SMPTE measurement by the members. I also personally find it very insightful, lots of new information to learn. But SMPTE also hosts webcasts with educational information covering hot topic technologies, issues, and developments in our industry. There are virtual courses available. They may be instructor-led or in a lot of cases are self-study. We have the SMPTE blog, the Newswatch newsletter, and also the Insights newsletter to allow you to get information about activities within SMPTE. In terms of membership, a reminder that we offer 4 levels of individual membership. One for a recent graduate. If you've had a student membership for the past 2 years, you're eligible for 2 years of the professional membership at a reduced rate of $49 for the first year and $99 for the second year. You have to be logged in to access this pricing, so you have to log into the SMPTE site as a student member to be able to get this information. There's an executive level membership, which gives you all of the professional membership plus invites to exclusive webinars and more, and it qualifies for standards participation member pricing. We have scholarships for students, a student membership that gives you access to scholarships, section networking, and access to industry leaders and at an affordable student-friendly price. And then our most popular level of membership, the professional level, that gives you comprehensive industry coverage with the journal subscription, access to members-only online content, discounts to various conferences, and a benefits package. And again, it qualifies for standards participation member pricing. Other options that are available, I'll just briefly mention, are the Life Member Donation. This is for Life members or Life Fellow membership by invitation only. You have to have 20 years of membership and be over 65. The contribution is $65 per year for this membership level if you're approved to take part in it. But any contribution is actually gratefully received. For retired members, there's a retired membership giving you all of the access that you need. It's for those who've retired from full-time work, not people who become consultants. For this level, you make your company name retired, and you contact membership at smpte.org for details. Talking about the membership levels, just briefly mention the individual levels that are available. For professional, it's $165 a year. That's well worth the money. Executive level is $275. Student is a mere $15 a year. Recent graduate for the first year, as I mentioned, is $49. For a retired member, it's $89. And if you're just a fan, you can get in for free. Do note that there is a 15% discount promotion still active. The discount code is 15 off, 150FF. And that offer is closing on June 31st. Sorry, June 30th, excuse me. At the end of June. Want to give a special call out to Ramona and Nevada County Media for allowing us to host our in-person attendance of this meeting at their facilities. And should you be interested in more information about Nevada County Media, Just follow the website connectivity here and get involved if you can. It's a wonderful organization, and we're very grateful to Ramona for allowing us to use their facility for our meetings. Tonight's presenter is Karl Paulsen. Karl is the Chief Technology Officer for Diversified, where he provides company-wide emerging technology advisory and strategic planning focused on advanced broadcast and media systems. He provides consulting and technology-driven broadcast engineering services, both internally to Diversified and externally to their customers, with a focus on long-term planning, workflow analysis, media asset management, and storage technologies. Karl is a fellow of SMPTE, an officer of the SMPTE Pittsburgh section, and participates in the SMPTE standards development processes. He's an SBE Life member, an SBE certified professional broadcast engineer, and a member of the AES and IEEE. Karl's held positions of CTO, VP, and Director of Engineering for a number of leading systems integration firms, both in the US and Canada. As its chief engineer, he engineered the facilities and launched KTZZ-TV Channel 22 in Seattle in 1985, becoming VP of Engineering for the CGI and visual effects firm Digital Post and Graphics in 1989. His projects and consulting activities as a system integrator include all of the major networks: CNN, HBO, Turner, Discovery, IMF, Al Jazeera, and broadcast group television stations, including Sinclair Broadcast, Acme Television, and Nexstar Broadcasting. He is clearly a very knowledgeable presenter, and I think we're going to gain a lot from his presentation today. His agenda for the meeting is a talk through Microsoft Production Studios. That means an introduction to Diversified and its many corporate entities, an overview of studios, plans, that's Microsoft Studios, plans and timeline for the transformation, discussion of the core infrastructure and the network setups, insight into the final implementations, and then some Q&A. And I apologize to those of you who are seeing this presentation for the first time as the recording. Due to some technical issues, the first few minutes of Karl's presentation did not get recorded, but we're going to edit into the point where the presentation with Karl started right now. Thank you all for your attendance, and I appreciate you stopping by to review the meeting.
Microsoft is Microsoft Production Studios. It's quite an impressive facility. It is Hollywood plus class, as you can tell just by some of the pictorials here, the screens. That is an LED wall screen behind there, a seamless LED wall powered by an Unreal Engine system, which you see portions of in the back in the right lower corner here. Each studio is fully equipped to do sound as well as video and animation, in some cases virtual tracking. They were doing quite a bit of virtual work before, but it turns out that it's probably easier to do the things you see in the larger picture here with the background screen than it is to do things otherwise. This is a kind of a floor plan or a footprint of the main studios themselves, 65,000 square feet. Upper left corner, give you an idea where this facility is. That's the I-520, the Highway 520 connection that goes across the bridges between Seattle and Redmond and literally bisects the main campus of Microsoft, which is huge and is under major reconstruction. They literally tore down every single building in that facility, or in that campus rather, and have rebuilt it in a completely different way, including a light rail system that stops in campus. The studios is a small little building. It's now officially the oldest building on the campus. And so when we finish this whole thing, it's highly likely that we will have built it as far as it can possibly be built in probably 3 to 4 years. I wouldn't be surprised if we see another facility come up on the agenda for them, just because this facility gets a tremendous amount of use. It's a 24/7 facility, and we'll get into some of the details of it here, but you can kind of see where things are. Oddly enough, on the right hand side is an area that they gave up a few years ago to the Microsoft Quantum Computing Research Lab. There's some really out in space stuff that goes on in that little lab there, but they'd love to have that space back, but they're not going to get it. It's likely to just stay where it is. So there's what the floor plan looks like. There are 2 floors to it. You come in the main entrance. Here is a beautiful lobby. It's a screened door. You go upstairs to where most of the editing rooms. There's several editing rooms down here, but there's editing rooms and multiple conference rooms, all interconnected with Microsoft Teams in quite a sophisticated way, which is quite integral to the production systems here. So I want to set the stage for this because you'll see very quickly that we weren't able to follow any of the rules that you normally do in a systems integration project. A typical systems process would begin with evaluation and assessment of what needs to be done. A conceptual design gets laid out, approved by the customer, and then you start laying out budget, your bill of materials, you get approvals for it, you put in order entries and purchase orders and things like that, while you probably move to design, laying out the new infrastructure. You put it all together, you integrate it all, then you test it, then you go through training, trials, rehearsals, and handover. And the biggest difference in this is this red dash line here. That's probably where everything to the right went away, and most of the stuff on the left had to get redone in a completely different way. And I'll show you what that means. The first step we did in this was an assessment process. This was about a 9-month, highly intense process of multiple sets of workshops and meetings with hundreds, at times hundreds of people, feeding Diversified's team information about things like discovery definition, defining goals and boundaries for the programs, the technical operations, looking at discovery sessions, really an interview process that involved myself and about 4 other core people, throwing questions at them and listening to their stories, and then transcribing every bit of it into a very complex document that was well over 250 pages before we delivered it to them about 9 months after it started. So the core goal here, of course, was to come up with some sort of statement of probable cost, or SOPC, for budget purposes. But the oddball thing about it is that Microsoft had already put their budgets in. Their budget planning was 18 months or more in advance of the issuance of it. And it's in quarterly increments. So everything that we did was tied to something that happened in 3-month intervals before we could move on to the next. And we had to complete those intervals. So the planning portions of it were quite complex and ongoing and literally didn't stop. Part of this assessment was an industry and discrete product evaluations. And I'm going to give you a sample here. This was not the actual work that was done in this project, but we leveraged this technique and technology to look at all the different parts and pieces. And I apologize for the tininess of it, but you can see how granular this gets. So in each area, we looked at an industry summary and an industry assessment. We looked at components and concepts and how they integrate across them. And then we picked the normal course of available manufacturers from which we developed RFIs and sent them out to them, had interviews, Q&A processes, and then began to score them in terms of what we felt they met from compliance and so forth. And that's what this little smaller section in here is, literally the report that came out of it, the functionality, how we scored its functionality, its performance, the availability of the products. Could you get them or not? Or we're going to have to wait for a year? Were they manageable? Did they interoperate with the other products we were supposed to be working with? Was there security, and were they scalable? Could we build them beyond it, or would we get stuck in a corner and have to buy something later on? So we didn't fill in any of these for obvious reasons. We really didn't want to favor one particular product or another, at least for this presentation. But we went through this for every single product of any major standards, the production switches, the cameras, the KVM, the audio, everything that you would build in a facility. So to summarize, we did 2 different phases for this assessment process. Phase 1 were a set of 5 workshops which were covering production resources and event usage. How do they use the facility? What do they use it for? What parts and pieces happen in it? What did studio operations look like? How many people were involved in productions? Were they at capacity? Did they have to do things remotely and so forth? How did the remote events work? What was the TOC or the BOC, Technical Operations Center, Broadcast Operations Centers? How did it work and function? What was an overview? How did they staff each of the various functions, editorial, production control, and audio control rooms, and so forth? So this took about the first 5 months, and this is really a qualifier for whether the budgets were right, whether they picked the right areas to look at. Was the project on track? Were the goals achievable? One curveball that came at us is that the staff on their own decided they didn't like their audio systems at all. So they basically threw a curveball at us and says, oh yeah, we're going to replace everything audio wise. Everything on the stage, excuse me, go back here. Everything that's on the stage, everything that's in the audio control and so forth. From this, we created RFQs and began to outline what the next phase would be, which was this phase 2. I'll get to in a second here. And then we proposed the intercom, and it was selected. That was really the first thing that was selected. We had many, many components that had to be done, but intercom was one of the most important ones because it's extremely critical to the operations of the facility. And then once we completed these sets of workshops in phase 1, they really wanted to get into depth in each of these to make sure they had the right selection. So phase 2 was 6 in-depth workshops, and these were workshops that consisted of 3 to 4 hour interview processes, a week follow-up later on, then Q&A and questions out to them, suggested products, and then interviews with each of the particular vendors that created that. So we did communications rather than just intercom, was all types of communications. The KVM system needed to be replaced and changed into IP. All the audio systems and the ACRs and control rooms needed to be looked at. How they operated and what was necessary for TOC and BOC, just like over here. And then some extra little item things like the multi-purpose rooms and editing. They have 18 edit suites there. And of those 18 edit suites, about a third of them do traditional editing. A third of them are really set up as mini production centers. And another third of them are executive briefing rooms that can be put together to look at core productions that are going on so that executives can go in there and talk among themselves and not be influenced by other people or other things going on. And then, of course, the IP core routing had to be determined, both the switches and the control systems. From that, we determined audio, KVM, the core IP switch centers, the sandbox components, and I'll get into sandbox in a minute here, and the production switcher vendor. The one thing that we didn't do out of this in-depth workshop initially was select a broadcast controller. And the real reason behind that is that we wanted to establish that all the products that have to be addressed by the broadcast controller were really pretty sound and we weren't going to deviate from them. For example, we decided very early on that the core switches, the leaf and switches and so forth, were going to be Arista, which was a bit strange in that the facility was all Cisco at that time. But it wasn't switching any media through it except in a compressed form, such as storage and compressed video for distribution. There was no IP video for it. And we felt pretty strongly that the long-term future was in what Arista was doing at the time as compared to what Cisco was going to be able to deliver to us. So those are the assessment processes. Additional things that happened was in each of these assessments, we did communications and audio sort of together. It turned out that after the interviews and so forth, there were 57 pages of single line level transcripts that were created. We generated the high level block diagrams. We made sure we had a 25% growth factor. We had split or dual capabilities with no single points of failure. Audio we knew would not be mapped to video. There's tremendous amount of audio that goes on here in multiple languages since the distribution is a global basis. The decision to discontinue Dante was made pretty early, and that we were going to leave Maddie in place as much as we could. Initially, the audio we understood because of delivery issues and so forth would be AES 67, or probably affectionately known as Ravenna, knowing that later on we would convert the AES 67/Ravenna system to ST2110-30 once that architecture was in place. The initial switch requirements for audio only, there was no video for the first 6 months or so of the operations, which was still quite an undertaking because it involved marrying the intercom systems, marrying the KVM systems, and the entire new Lavo audio systems together, and being sure that it was functional for what they needed for the long term. The architecture was one primary video with 16 channels per stream allocated. So any one video stream, if it mapped 1-to-1, would have 16 channels of audio. And that's so they could do both surround sound and stereo and multi-language, multilingual capabilities, including sign language and things of that nature, since they meet all the requirements that a broadcaster would be required to meet in order to put something on the air. It was already understood that the intercom, which was an RTS, was the end of life. So we had to deal with that, knowing that it would have to be completely changed. And that's clear out to the edge points. And that the initial network itself would later shift, meaning that after we put in the Arista systems, we would be migrating the Cisco corporate network systems, the internet, the streaming, and so forth, to Arista. But that's still literally on the drawing board as we speak today. The other thing we did was determine that they wanted, for future proofing and for testing and for evaluation, to build a sandbox out. Now, some people think of a sandbox as more like a lab environment where you put a few pieces and parts together. No. Microsoft wanted an identical mirror of what's in the production media fabric to appear in the sandbox, so that any major software lifts or changes in architecture or new products that were being brought in could be fully vetted and tested on identical systems. And the sandbox included not just identical core switches, which you'll see some pictures of later on, but it also included the software that ran the EOS, the operating systems for the Arista systems, as well as a duplicate broadcast controller. So if any one component failed in the main system, that was going to be a huge catastrophe, we could lift and shift something out of the sandbox and put it right back in line. There shouldn't be a problem with it. And so far, knock on wood, we haven't had any issues like that. So part of the sandbox was to involve the initial plans, which was to build the sandbox out first. Well, that idea kind of went bye-bye real quick when we found out, due to supply chain issues, that we weren't going to get the Arista switches for both the sandbox and for the active production network. And so we went ahead and built the actual active production network out. Again, you'll see some diagram that said this a little bit later, before we built the sandbox. In fact, the sandbox hasn't even been stood up yet at all. This kind of created a dilemma in that what we did for actual testing was the real actual primary network. We didn't have a way to fall back on something else and see what happened. Both the sandbox and the primary network would be red and blue compatible, so that we could do ST 2022-7 or hitless switching and so forth. And then the other portions of this dive in these workshops was to come up with an IP addressing schema that would work for both types of systems. The key takeaways from the end of these sessions or these workshops was a detailed map of the tier 1 and tier 2, and a definition, a plan how we're going to get from AES 67 to 2110-30, which is the audio format for IP. And then what would be the impact of all the intercom changes, all the fly packs out in the field, all the remotes, all the campus extensions. Since Microsoft not only operates things in their studios, they operate a number of conference centers, huge conference centers, and a number of smaller facilities for production, including one that sits in the CEO's office itself. And then, of course, the moving away from Cisco to Arista. The in addition to what I just explained, we also had to deal with the KVM. So that was a set of interviews about how we want to use it. Do we do IP? Do we stay analog? What's going to make the most sense? That ended up with the 26 pages of transcripts and reports. It talked about how we were going to do it managed system, how the IP system discussions were going to go forward, whether people were comfortable. And believe me, there were a lot of arguments and a lot of people that did not want to have anything to do with anything other than what they were already familiar with. KVM also bridged out into Tally, how they were going to control multi-viewers and distribution. Microsoft distributes the output of every multi-viewer back into their current SDI routing system, and then distribute it anywhere else in the world that they need to send it to, as a compressed stream or as a full bandwidth system, depending on what they're doing. And all of that came out of what they had to deal with from COVID-19, creating the abandonment of on-site production and going entirely to virtual. So they learned a great deal in a very quick period of time about how they had to re-architect their SDI system. And they basically ran out of horsepower. They didn't have any more capabilities, which was the major promoter for going down this path. The KVM had to attach to the control rooms and to the remote operations so that people could operate a KVM from their home or from a hotel room somewhere or from a remote location. It involves some machine control integration and some very interesting workflow processes that had to be determined, how they were going to do ingest, how they're going to do play out, how they were going to do imaging, dynamic routing of the multi-viewer outputs, as I explained, the prompters, 500 to 100 Teams / PC management systems, little PC nooks, applications, how we're going to distribute NDI and SRT. So this is not just an IP facility from the standpoint of ST2110. It is a multi-purpose, multi-format distribution system, as well as a transmission system. And then we identified any missing and future needs from the operations perspective. Similar things went on with the audio control rooms. We had to look at how many channel assignments, how the hybrid routing systems were going to change, how PCRs versus edit rooms and multi-purpose rooms were going to happen, and how we were going to go about merging Dante into MADI, since at that time it was an SSL system, moving to a Lavo Ravenna system. Knowing that we were going to do non-managed switch sets, meaning the Arista switches and so forth, would be in an unmanaged mode for AES-67. Once we did the migration at the end of the process, which is just recently completed in the last month or so, that we would go from a non-managed system to a managed switch system, which is a completely new programming, completely new multicast addresses. Every single thing had to change. And it had to change literally over one weekend in order to stay functional. When and how we were going to get rid of Dante and how Lavo was going to work, since Lavo has its own little world with its different structures in terms of management and control systems versus others. Then, of course, we had Tally, control, GPIO requirements out of audio, and then how we're going to deal with all the audio issues, particularly in the cross-campus requirements. TOC and BOC, or broadcast operations control, similar sorts of things. 49 pages of transcripts, 28,600 words, and I kid you not, I'm the guy that edited every one of these pages, so I know the numbers are right. And it was delivered in late June of 2021. This is well ahead of the actual ordering of equipment, other than the switches and some major components that we had to get due to long lead times. We needed to know the locations of each work area, what the proposed functions and what the space updates would be, since we knew, and here's some pictures down here on the right. The one on the right hand side is the main console for operations. The one back here, the one on the left, this section here in the forward part of that picture is the actual replay control and ingest management system, which was dreadfully tiny. When we were doing live productions with sets of EVS and Dreamcatchers both in place, you couldn't get enough people in this room to function properly. So we knew that in addition to all the technical changes, wiring changes and so forth, this room was almost going to double in size from a physical standpoint. So there are new things that were constantly being added to us, including how we, the working descriptions of what the various PCRs, including PCR 0 and ACR 0s, how we manage the incoming feeds to move from both compressed and uncompressed or SDI gateway signals through the system. And then, try as we might, we couldn't convince them to stay with just one form of replay and ingest system. No, they use both EVS and dream catchers because there's enough difference in functionality between the two for what they do, what Microsoft does and produces, not just for large events like Invent and things of that nature, but and Microsoft Build. These are their flagship shows, but for their normal everyday uses, since this room is a 24/7 room, even though you don't see any people sitting here at that time. Then I explained that these multi-purpose rooms were shifting from the use of just dedicated edit to multi-purpose and adaptable rooms. We literally wanted to be able to say, today the room's an edit suite, this afternoon we want it to be a production control room. And that's where we're headed with this, leveraging the new KVM systems and the assignments and so forth. So a little bit more about how we went about making decisions and planning and scheduling. We had a number of brainstorm sessions, many of them going in late into dinner, over bar napkins and things like that, that I kid you not, we must have had more meetings with whiteboards full of stuff, post-it notes on walls and so forth in order to make this whole process a little bit easier. We came up with a process called Protocol Implementation Conformance. This is actually something that SMPTE is working on in the standards development as a means to describe how to test and conform equipment instead of doing an interop session every single time that a whole bunch of new equipment produces. This is a document that walks the manufacturer, and it is manufacturer intended, through each of the steps and considerations across all of the elements of the SMPTE's 2110 standard suites. So I took and adapted that work, which I was a participant on, and it's still ongoing, and just wrote out little functional descriptions that you can see here. This is obviously related to intercom. And here's the feature or the question. The current intercom is in dire need to be expanded, replaced, or updated. This section describes the various intentions or directions. So question 1 or requirement level number 1, the intent is to replace the intercom completely. We'd ask the team, is this true or is this false? And their intent was to completely replace the intercom. If they'd have said no and that they were going to try and build out the existing system or extend its purpose, which was RTS, then it would have been a different design process. But we wanted them to know that this is the direction they were going. And each one of these things kind of leads into the next one. The current RTS intercom is the end of life and cannot be modified. If yes, then continue to section. If not, well, it is end of life. It could be modified. So that answer is no. And you can kind of see this is the thought process that we led the Microsoft team through, so that nothing was left out. We didn't miss something. We didn't do something we might have forgotten later on, or someone could have come back and said, oh, no, I needed it to do this, and now it doesn't do that, so I'm unhappy. And believe me, that happens in design, particularly when budgets start to happen. And the most fortunate part about this from our standpoint is that Microsoft basically had an open checkbook for this. And that's very, very rare, underscored. We were totally amazed that almost nothing got thrown out of the project until probably the latter end of it, where we've now put several things aside just because there was a finite limit to the checkbook. And they finally made us think and said, well, and we kind of expected it, you know, once things start functioning and new pictures can be seen and new facilities are up and operational and people are beginning to be happy, they don't have to say that we can't do something because we don't have any capacity. Then all of a sudden they start to scrutinize the budget a little bit more, and that's typical almost any business. And then we laid out, rather than a complex Gantt chart that you might have expected, we laid out some very simple things based upon weeks and dates and so forth. And this has to do with when we were picking out and evaluating the broadcast controller. We'd set out RFP quotes. We'd come back and evaluate the RFP and the quote costs. Then we request a demo. We'd have to wait for the demo. Then we'd stand up a small network. Then we'd evaluate them, make a final selection from the RFP, and then continue on down the work. So we literally did this kind of layout for every section of the facility, and there were multiple sets of these spreadsheets created. The next part of this after the assessment is, and this is also, excuse me, pretty typical of large-scale projects or particular projects that go on for years and years, is that you create what's called a basis of design, or a BOD. And what contains in that is a written order of things that you need to do. Side by side with that, you need to identify the risk factors. And a risk factor could be, what if there isn't sufficient budget for it? What if the operator hates the product, like doesn't like the control panels or something? What if they can't deliver the products? What if it doesn't integrate with other things? All these risk factors got identified, again, in another set of spreadsheets or whiteboards or post-it note applications. Again, so that no one was going to be surprised by the consequences of making decisions. Then we would describe functional alternatives and what was applicable, what we needed to do in terms of a POC, a proof of concept. Did we need to do a proof of concept? And from this, we came back with the major component selections like the KVM and so forth. We also went at the same time, created naming for them, because there need to be new naming infrastructures and architectures, and new schemas and what the IP assignments would be, both the static IP addresses and the multicast IP addresses. Then we needed to clearly state what could be done now and what must wait and why in each of those cases. We did state network design concepts and hardware needs. We applied dates, we investigated the alternatives, we get a general buy-in from those on the production side, the finance side, the operations side, and the senior corporate executives, since there are leadership over the top of this was helping us make decisions. And then we planned the budget, which meant that things had to be allocated in quarterly funds. So the vendors had to really come clean to us as to when they could deliver a product, because the finance, the ability to pay for that from the Microsoft funding processes, corporate funding processes, was essential to us placing an order. And then on top of that, we'd apply the labor components and create the timelines for the implementations. So at a pretty broad level, this is the timeline that happened. The consulting and assessment started around September 2021, and it ended with its deliverable in October 22. So, you know, a little over 13 months of work went into planning this. We determined the network fabric from Arista early, and then the initial shipments of the Arista, and this is maybe 20% of what we needed for the whole facility, were planned for delivery in April 2022. We were very fortunate, being that Microsoft Azure uses Arista as their core system for their internet and their systems overall, that there is a huge inventory of Arista products that we could literally beg, borrow, and steal to obtain while we're waiting for advanced shipments for the intercom, for the audio, and the core systems. So there is something that was of benefit to this particular client, and that is the fact that one of the largest internet data center systems was going to be the same fabric, same plans. And the trade-off for that was we were going to be able to feed signals from the facility into Azure for their own purposes, whatever that may be. We created the basis of design, which was a post-assessment project. So we really didn't begin the basis of the design until October, November of 2022. Then we got thrown the curveball with supply chain issues. We ended up having to delay phase 2 Arista clear through Q4 of 2022. So we had lots of other things to do. Obviously, we had fiber infrastructure and things like that that had to be built out. but we weren't going to be able to turn on any IP signals until sometime after Q4 of 2022, December of last year. And it turns out that only the cores and 50% of the leafs could be delivered through Q2 of 2023. That's this year. In other words, as of today, we still don't have all the products to make this work. And we had to make a conscious decision to say, how much of the system can we stand up and make work and meet the objectives that corporate finance placed on us? You know, you're buying millions of dollars worth of gear, and they want to know, why is it still sitting in boxes, or why can't we use it yet? So the balance of the leafs have not been delivered yet, and we ended up having to build only a red network and hold off on a blue network. So this is a facility that's been online and operating with half of its network functionality and no redundancy at all. And that gives a lot of credit to the fact of the way it was designed and the planning that had to go into this, and the redundancy and resiliency that's in this facility. So the next 5 slides are going to be a bit of a blur, but it'll give you an idea of the number of things we had to do in parallel simultaneously in order to get this system to work. So starting clear back here in the 2021 timeframe, we did the assessments, part 1 and part 2, or phase 1 to phase 2. The key vendor POC studies were made, and the key broadcast controller was ordered not until July of 2022. And the key controller is the Magellan SDNO platform, which we put a lot of faith, and there was a lot of cooperation with the folks at Imagine Communications to make this work. I mean, they pretty much kind of guessed that they were going to get this, but there was no guarantee. There was no signed PO until July of 2022, at which point we had to turn the factory on, and they had to turn around and deliver. The phase 1 switches were ordered, and the lead times were anticipated. You can see initial concepts and designs. The phase 1 systems infrastructure, that's the fiber, the power, the cooling, and all these sorts of things were all happening in this kind of time frame. And then somewhere after the assessment, the concept and design actually did begin, putting things onto pieces of paper and drawings that would eventually come forward. We also took on a process of looking at long-term workflow and flexibility identification. So how much of this can we really give them and make work? You know, having a nice new KVM system doesn't mean anything if the gear that it has to control isn't there and isn't working right. This is the next page of it. Here's some more key vendors. POC studies continued because they hadn't made up their minds yet. They hadn't decided on production switches or cameras and so forth. Some of the phase 2 lead times for the Arista, when the controller was determined, the Arista cores and leafs were ordered, and the lead time for phase 2 was architected, and then there was a lot of waiting. Full design continued on all the systems. The leaf switches were deployed, the KVM, the intercom, and the audio was put together, and the production audio becomes operative around this time frame. The next set of group core switches and leafs were to arrive during this period. The red and blue cores, but only the red leafs arrived. We didn't have enough to do a fully functional system with both red and blue cores, switches, or cores or leafs actually. Again, Arista lead times just continued to happen. I mean, it was unfortunate, but it was almost a year plus, even with the leverage that we could get with Azure, before we could get significant switch components in order to turn this thing up and make it work. So the KVM and the intercom, the audio, audio and intercom became operative, and the intercom also included a whole brand new wireless IFB system as well. Then we began building the infrastructure. We started receiving SNPs from Imagine. The test and measurement gear started to come, and the Magellan system came together. And then we could start this SDI to IP migration, clear it out here. And we're looking at now Q1 2023. So we still, at this point, the beginning of this year, we still do not have an operational functional system. Full design continued, production switchers and partial consideration were brought in. The infrastructure build keeps coming up here again. These are the major gateways and other components here. The migration started. And as we built the SDI to IP 2110 migration, we also had to do the audio conversion to -30. And then sometime around the end of January, we started to get worried. We weren't sure any more than Microsoft was sure that this could happen the way we planned. One of the fallbacks that we put in here was that we could switch back to SDI if we had to. That would have been very disillusioning and disappointing to everybody, but we had to be prepared to do that in case we couldn't get the switches or we couldn't get some major component that was necessary. So we made the decision on the 10th of February of this year to go forward with it. The major reason for that was we again did another risk assessment and felt that there was more risk of us trying to go back to SDI than there was to go forward with IP. And that was a real heartthrob to everybody, because we might have had to do a no-go. And the fallback to SDI for all the major production works may have meant that the IP system might not have gotten built at all. And so that was one of the toughest decisions. Mainly our team, our engineering team, swallowed it and said, yeah, we recognize this is many, many hours and long days, and we have to work around a number of different things, including the productions. But there were hard, fast dates that were necessary, and the decision was made forward, and we went ahead for the conversion. So part of the risk assessment and the system design was that we were going to end up, as I said, with a blue only system. And at this point, we now abandon the IP, the SDI, turn the SDI routers off, push them over, pulled them out and got them out of the room and so forth, and made way for to go forward. So the rest of the remainder of the Arista Leafs are to be delivered around October 2023. There are service windows that we had to define also as part of the planning, not just for the build portions of it, but for the long-term maintenance and commitment of the facility. Like other large facilities, CNN, HBO, ABC News, things like that are going or have gone to IP, they literally have an agreement with the major vendors to say, this is the window that we have open to make a change, to do an upgrade in the switch fabrics themselves, maybe the EOS system, the AMCS is what Arista calls it. And the period is maybe a 3-week window there where we can take portions of the facility down, or we can work only on the red network and not the blue, things of that nature. Almost every major facility of any scale has to do this. And this is why the integration of the vendors, as well as the integration company and the end user, the owner, all are in continual lockstep with each other. So the next ending phase of this will be the phase 2 system, where we'll get the other switches in, we'll build the red network startups, we'll finish out all the cores, the full sandbox will then be built up, and then we'll shut down and convert everything to 2022-7 sometime around the year end 2023. And there's a window in the December timeframe of this year where the facility can literally be turned off. There won't be any production, and that'll be essential in order to make these final changes. So you can kind of get an idea of the length and the things that we had to go through and are still going through in this almost 30-month plus process so far. So at the beginning of this, you've got an entire organization who knows next to nothing other than some training that they've gone through, some Wes Simpson type presentations and so forth, about what 2110 is, and some things that our company did, a couple of different sets of presentations, which some people have been to, some people hadn't seen any of this at all. There was actually a perception that by the IT group that says that if you throw enough bandwidth at it, nothing will fail. Well, you can always take a risk that something's going to fail, but that was the mentality. It's, we're going to put enough horsepower here that nothing can go wrong. And then people started to think, how complex does this really get? Well, it's very complex. It's hundreds of thousands of flows that go on in the system all the time. It's not anything like SDI and AES. And then the next thought was, what is it that we don't know? I mean, you've often heard the statement, we don't know what we don't know. Well, that was very true. We didn't know in some cases until we actually turned things up and played with it itself. And then there is a mandate. This was not a light statement at all the way to the corporate vice presidents, CVPs in Microsoft, saying there needs to be extreme reliability in this, and there needs to be a data center focus on how this works. They don't expect Azure's internet systems to go down. They don't expect Microsoft Production Studios to go down. And not necessarily a quote by any means, but those of us that remember the introductions of Windows, when Bill Gates stood on stage and started to show the first introductions of one of the Windows platforms, and the blue screen of death came up, that cost Microsoft millions, maybe even billions of dollars in reputation and potential revenue. I'm not saying numbers are quite that high in this project, but we've certainly been reminded of this. This shall not blue screen of death ever. And hence they put a lot of money into the infrastructure to make this thing work the way it does. And now I'll show you a little bit about what we went through. There's a lot of dotted lines here because we didn't build them all out at first. At the beginning, we could only get one large frame, 400 gig backbone frame. It's a 7800 series Arista switcher to start with. And when we put the Ravenna audio system, not the Dash 30 system, in a read-only format, we had 32 Arista switches for management fabric, the DMF, on 32 ports per switch. We had 4X red spine cores, one at first, and then 3 more came in, plus their line cards. And there are 7 Arista switches for audio only that built out the original system for just the audio. And this is the intercom audio and the Lavo audio system. Where we were going was something that looked more like this, but none of these components were here. PTP system got built out on an Evert system, knowing that we were going to migrate all of that probably next month to a Meinberg system. So this is what the system kind of looked at a very, very high level. Digging down a little bit deeper, this is where it actually turns out at this point in time, is a pair of red spines going to the various leafs, the purple networks for the single-ended products, the blue network, which wasn't put together at all, and the PTP system all built up this way. In this facility, there's roughly 21.7 miles of new fiber installation that came in. Everything is fiber, with the exception of some of the audio, which is RJ45 connectors, twisted pair, and so forth. And we're going to do this entirely new PTP NTP system sometime in July of this year. So still a lot of things to do. 95 imagined Selenium network processors. Now, the reason for this is quite bold. A lot of the products like this, the dream catchers and the EVS and so forth, the new products came with IP cards in them, and the existing products which were going to be upgraded were waiting for IP cards. Despite the fact that we might have been delivered the cards for the interfaces, we literally had only enough time to put Selenium network processors, the SMPs, as gateways from the SDI router to IP and the IP back to SDI router. And we did this for a couple of reasons. You heard me earlier explain that we had to do a system that could fall back to SDI if something blew up on our face really badly. So the decision literally was to take every signal in the plant, SDI primarily, and run it into an SMP, take the SMP outfit and feed it back into the SDI router. So there was a loop through of every single signal through a gateway, which did 2 things: processed the SDI and converted it to IP. And we use that architecture for everything in the facility, hence the reason for 95 SMPs. You see. Another sort of broader view with the 4 sets of spines, spine 1, 2, 3, and 4. So ultimately, the way this works from a data center mentality is we use spines 1, 2, and 3 as active full-time systems for distribution, probably way overkill. But then there's a fourth spine standing in the side, active signals in it, but not active from the standpoint of something it would fail to without some sort of manual intervention. Automatic systems will come probably later. That's probably going to be another scope of work, or it may be held off until there's a decision to stay in that building or not, depending upon space. And then all the various red leaves here. Here's the purple leaves, mainly for intercom devices, single-ended intercom devices and things like that. And of course, none of this is built right now. It'll probably be the end of the year before we get to a 2022 environment exclusively end-to-end. Proof of concepts were pretty important to everybody. And the weird thing about it is you've got engineers that work for Microsoft and you've got contractors that work for Microsoft. Most of them had not had their hands on 2110 at all. We didn't have enough systems with signals in them to do much more than play in the lab, connect to a few things here and there. So we had to do intense evaluation of these different products and their availabilities and their functionality. The first thing we did was we eliminated any of those vendors with limited experience or no experience in working with Arista. Now, everybody says they work with both Cisco and Arista, but the $64,000 question is, how well do you work? And what's your roadmap for completing full functionality of Arista's capabilities? And so we evaluated the Evert system, the Magnum. We evaluated Grass Valley's Orbit, and we peripherally looked at EVS, although EVS was well into the project that we were doing for Fox Sports that was going to do the FIFA Cup and so forth. And they were really their first process at any scale to do a large scale IP implementation. So EVS, a fine product, it does some very amazing things, but we elected to sideline EVS for further consideration, strictly for that reason. Not that it's a bad product, not that it doesn't work. It's just that we needed to have things that we could put our hands on and be sure that it was going to work. We selected Imagine Communications Magellan system. A lot of them had to do with the fact that we had just finished the NFL media facilities in El Segundo, California, which was entirely Imagine Communications. Very, very similar architecture, not the scale of the switches and so forth. But we felt comfortable that by selecting Imagine Communications, we could build the NFL system again in Microsoft if we had to. Imagine delivered us a fully working SDNO demo system with SMPs in it. It went into the lab. Our lab guys got to learn how to program the routers, how to play the switches, their first hands-on stuff with IP to any serious level. And then they decided, with Imagine's permission, that they were going to tear that thing apart, that demo system apart, and start to learn to use it, put it back together for their own functionality. So I can't say enough about how helpful Imagine was in this. And it was a big sale for them. It's a huge, huge, huge sale, more than what was at the NFL by probably 30% or more. So they were very cooperative. This again is just another photo here for fluff of what the Unreal system, which is located in the backstage. So the initial upgrades required the vetting of the KVM system, which we awarded to Black Box, their newer IP version, Boxzilla and so forth, an IP intercom and wireless, which was given to Riedel and Bolero. The total system for audio was all Lavo, and we know the stories on that. Lo and behold, we didn't know that they were going to replace the switchers and the cameras. So Microsoft picked the Grass Valley K-frame. We wired everything for it. They delivered the switchers. And then we got the bad news. Not everything was there. So after we installed the K-frames and had them working in an SDI mode, because we bought one with SDI only, with cards to put in, with the extra cards to make them IP, and we bought another one with IP and SDI both together. put them in, got them working, only to find out there weren't enough parts working from the IP side. So we took them all out again and put the old systems back in, including retrofitting brand new consoles and switcher tubs and so forth. And that was a hope this doesn't last this way forever, but eventually we know everything necessary or from the K-frame switches are in there. And the K-frames were selected because they wanted to be able to distribute switcher frames to these multifunction rooms I was telling you about earlier. Then the studio camera announcement came. Oh, we're going to buy new cameras too. Cameras aren't quite as complicated as production switches to put in, with the exception that cameras have a whole lot more things going into them, like tally, like intercom, like return feeds, like remote capabilities, all these other sorts of things. And of course, they bought 4K switchers, or 4K switchers and 4K cameras, but we elected very early on that we'll wire the infrastructure and prepare it bandwidth-wise and functionality-wise for UHD, but we're only going to operate in HD now. There are only so many things we can do, and this was integral to the planning process for this facility, was to be sure that we could get to the endpoints without having to rip everything out and start all over again. This is a little layout of the facility itself. You can see these are the equipment rooms in the core. It's not a gigantic equipment room. And remember, there was SDI stuff in here working, and then we layered in the IP stuff. So one of the first things that happened was the fiber tray system over the top of this. And this was all the cross patches, which were Huber and Sooner Lisa systems. And oh, by the way, they didn't want to abandon all the multi-mode fiber that's in there. So there's a hybrid system, both single mode and multi-mode. Most facilities that are brand new will build a single mode fiber system only. But nope, we had to throw another curveball in here that's both SM and multi-mode. For new trays on both floors. And by the way, there was absolutely zero space. I said limited underfloor space. There was zero under the floor space. And then the whole decommissioning process of pulling stuff out only to make room for the next things that went in there. So here's a typical drawing that you might see. One of our guys came up with an idea. Well, let's lay all the racks out on the floor, but then we'll go photograph what's behind and what's in front of every one of them. We'll lay them on this drawing so that when we blow this up, we can see what kind of disaster we've got standing in our face when we get ready to actually either remove and decommission gear or add new gear. So that was just kind of an underflow. They call it an underflow survey, but we used it a whole lot more than we really expected to. The IP build, as I said earlier, was the data center model. 3/4 of the system is functional. The last quarter of the system is redundant or resilient to the resilient systems already. There were quad cores. I don't know. We did a sort of cursory sample of various IP facilities around the world. I think we found one other facility that had quad cores, and they weren't near the extensibility that this is, but we didn't ever get to talk to them to find out why they did it that way. It's a multi 400 gigabit backbone and distribution to leafs, and these switches can be upgraded to 800 gig. 3 active cores and 1 live standby. It's entirely 100 gig with 400 gig uplinks to and from various switches. There are 2 completely separate network cores, a PMF, which stands for Production Media Fabric. That's the hands-on, once it's running, nobody touches it type environment. And then there's the sandbox. Both of them are red-blue designed and cabled and ready to run that way. And then we offered potentially direct feeds into Azure at 400 gig bandwidths, literally so that in the future, if uncompressed IP video wants to get to the internet, which I'm not saying is a likelihood, they could do that. What we think is probably going to happen is the whole world will migrate to a compressed video format of some form, a JPEG XS or something of that nature, which is 2110-22. The system is designed to run both ways. We have not had any chance to really test the 22-22 systems yet. It is an uncompressed UHD design. Issues in the design, the basis of design that we had to deal with was both the fiber being both single mode and multi-mode. So there are calculations in place to be sure that we don't get anywhere close to 50% of the bandwidth limitations in a multi-mode environment. There's lots of coordination, lots of very interesting calculations were done to deal with the 100 gig feeds out of the switches and coordinating to 10 and 25 gig products, because there aren't too many broadcast video products right now that accept 100 gig inputs, except with the exception of servers such as EVS or Dreamcatcher and production switchers. Almost all of the leaf extensions are 400 gig inputs and then 100 gig switch ports out of them. So you can imagine the costs and the amount of SFPs that are involved in this facility. We did find some inconsistencies. We had spine line card issues, which were later corrected. Again, this was in part given the bandwidth requirements and resiliency requirements. And we had the Arista / Azure dedicated team that lives on campus to support Azure, deeply involved in this, running scripts for testing, making sure we can migrate from one format to another, all the different platforms and so forth that we have to deal with. I mean, I can't thank the major vendors enough, because everybody cooperated with everybody in order to get this to work. Again, another complication was this configuration from Ravenna to -30. And we were very fortunate that we had one smart gentleman who worked on the project, who designed the intercom system and then turned around and designed the Lavo audio systems, who literally lived in the audio control rooms, reprogramming systems when we went from Ravenna to -30. In addition to other things that were going on with design issues, there was a major change in staff towards the end of last year, changes in third-party contractors, new operations people, and new consultancies that were brought in. And then we had all the complexities of everybody agreeing to what we were going to do for naming of the various equivalent networks, the DMF, PMF, HMF, sandbox equivalents, and so forth. So there's many things, if you haven't figured that out yet, that went into this. We had to deal with how we're going to do system-wide updating, the time slots for production hurdles. In addition to, can we get the manufacturers to cooperate with us? We had to still be able to address the major products or the major shows that they do, which is either 3 or 4 a year, where the CEO comes in and stands up, for half the day and tells everybody about all the new fancy things that Microsoft's offering. We had to define how often, when, and what happens during the service windows, and the SDI standby failback in case of delays. Well, obviously, when we made the decision to go forward at the end of February, there was no going back. We could literally switch the SDI router off and be happy and be comfortable that we wouldn't have to back the other way. We learned partway, probably early this year, that the P2P system was going to be changed over, and that we had to deal with new feeder plans for the audio leads themselves. The 100 gig interfaces were cumbersome with low bit rate signal inefficiencies. In other words, if you need to feed 10 gig to something, are you going to have to waste a 100 gig port to do that? And how do we do that with quad 25 gig or 10 or groups of 40, whatever it happens to be? All that bandwidth all had to be calculated on spreadsheets and then vetted with the engineering people before we could just go install it. And then, of course, we wound out realizing that we had insufficient power and insufficient cooling. So while you're sitting there wondering how you're going to power all this stuff, and there were extension cords running down halls and into other rooms and things like you can't believe, you cross your fingers that the fire marshal doesn't come in and shut the whole facility down. But we successfully changed almost 100% of the power, got updated, and probably another 30% cooling had to get added, including UPSs and generator backups. Other issues impacting the migration, the continual changes in service editions. I mean, we'd go to a meeting and Microsoft would say, we're going to buy such and such, and we have to get it installed because we only have the window for finances to spend the money during this period of time. It's like, stop the horses, stop the presses, Go redesign this stuff, figure out how you can get it installed and prove that it's operational and functional so that the POs can get paid. The production shutdowns with the CER were off limit periods. There are literally red lights in there that when they're on, Microsoft security will come in and haul you off like you're going to jail if you touch anything in any of those rooms. And so it was literally, okay, we have to do a production. It has to be live, hands off, walk out of the room and shut it off. Microsoft production facility years ago was an MPAA certified facility when they were doing first run movies for Microsoft Xbox platforms. If any of you remember when you could literally have a subscription and look at new motion pictures on Xbox, which meant the cages and so forth had security cameras on them, had password connections, were timed entrances and exits. It was, I was in there years ago and saw this facility and I thought, I've never seen anything like this, but it's literally like a jail in the technical equipment room, so that there were no risks that something would either get stolen or get shut down. And then the staff had to learn all of this stuff while it's in flight. They've got a day job of keeping the facility running in an SDI mode while they're learning how to do an IP mode. So having this demo sandbox was very much needed for each of the tech teams. And as I said, minimal familiarity with this, with IP or SDI to IP. But then they had all this new test gear to learn. I mean, packet storm, IP evaluation gears, Matrox, new test instruments for that, both leader and telestream waveform monitor systems, virtual and otherwise. All of this stuff had to get learned by these guys, and they're just doing an amazing job. Having a minimal number of SDI signals also complicated both commissioning and evaluations. Supply chain, supply chain, supply chain, and supply chain. We all got so tired of hearing that word. It's like a bad nightmare. Pre-ordering of placements was necessary, well ahead of the design. We picked products before we knew we had to really design them. Router panels. Nobody seemed to like what Imagine had offered for router panels. So we went to another company, and we worked with Imagine to have another third party develop a new entire control panel system and get that integrated. Same thing sort of going on with the multi-viewers. There hasn't been a final multi-viewer picked. So we had to buy something, hope it could get delivered, knowing that may very well be turned out to the waste yard, to the landfill later on. But that's what we had to do. Switch fabrics, Arista lead times is over. We all hear about that. Contingencies for on-air deadlines had to be developed. What happens if we had to drag a mobile truck in and hook it up for the system because we couldn't get the rest of the facility to work? I mentioned the staff and the management changes mid-project. The director of the facility retired in December, and the production manager, chief engineer, left the company shortly thereafter. I mean, it's hard enough to teach people, teach the dogs new tricks, but when we didn't even have the dogs, it really became kind of a nightmare. So you can kind of see where we went through the different portions of it. And just a couple more slides here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We've all heard about NMOS. We could not believe how important NMOS was to this facility, since there was a high expectation that all of the management of the systems would be in band. In other words, the control of the devices themselves would be in the same bandwidth as the IP streams themselves. We had to figure out which ones still wouldn't support it, even though they said they would. In many cases, you had to hook it up and try it and find out it wouldn't work. Other parts of it was that we realized fairly quickly on is that the NMOS ISO 4 and 05 needs to be fully functional first before you can do anything with the databases and the other systems. Devices to databases required NMOS to be working before you could start to assign the names to them or which ports that they were going to talk to. And delays occurred because NMOS between the server and endpoint devices was not established. Again, you had no idea what the impact of that was until you actually turned the box on and tried to get it to work. And then you dig into it down to the code level of the SDP files and say, oh, somebody put a typo in the SDP file. It says 1080p, but they put 1080D or something instead of it. And in many cases, we had to end up fixing these things ourselves because we couldn't wait to either send the product back or get support from the vendor over a telephone line. The exchange of data in NMOS to get a system working like this is very, very important. And a lot of what we learned out of this has been fed back to the AMWA and other working committees so we can be sure this gets replicated to all the manufacturers rather than just one or two. So that was certainly one of the biggest parts of this. So here's a couple more pictures and I'll open this up for questions. This is what a temporary master control looks like to do one of the streams for one of the big productions. The facility can bring in upwards of 150 to 200 people to do one of these productions. It's truly a huge undertaking. And the right here is what the COVID-19 PCR setup had to look like. That's it, Paul. The YouTube thing down below is 9 years old. You might, if you look at it with a joke because it's very, very old, but it would give you some idea of what the facility looks like in a real video mode. So, and that's it. Any questions, anybody?
Thank you, Carl. Well, we very much appreciate the presentation. We're going to bring the house lights up. If you have a question, please come up to the podium because that's where the microphone is. And oh, geez. Anybody, any questions?
Well, did he make a lot of money on this project?
Asking, did you make a lot of money?
Well, let's put it this way. There's a lot of hardware in here and there's a lot of labor in here and still to come. So we think we did. But that's probably an internal take on it rather than something I really went.
Yeah, I think you should not say anything publicly about that one.
No. I mean, through proper management, both by the client, and of our operations. I mean, it takes a lot of people to do this. Just the physical implementation people. We probably had 12 full-time technical folks on there. I know we had a dozen engineers. We had numerous other people in the purchasing side of our company. We have project management folks, all sorts of stuff. So I would bet there's 75 to 100 people involved at one time or another, not all the time. And you can do the math pretty quickly to see what kind of labor numbers could be that could come out of that.
Anybody else? Any questions?
Yeah,
Yes.
quick question. So you mentioned the staff didn't have any experience with 2110. So how did you rectify that? What kind of training curriculum did you do for them?
Very good question. Before we even started this, some of the engineering people, the managers primarily, had gone to some of the online schools that SMPTE offers, some of the training that people like Wes Simpson and others, learnipvideo.com, do. I gave several condensed seminars to them. Diversified, about 3 years before COVID hit, put together what we call the IP Roadshow kit. It was a totally functional portable lab. Portable is tongue in cheek on that one. It was 2 375-pound flight cases that we shipped all over the world. And I would do 8 to 16-hour training sessions with the support of vendors, which became really essential to those that were thinking about going IP. So those kind of trainings were going on in there. Then, as with any product sold by any vendor worth its name, there are training opportunities available. Now, the training can be something as simple as, how this is the function of it, this is how you set it up, this is how you configure it. As complex as to here's how to troubleshoot it and what to look for. It all varies by vendor. That's one of the things that you want to be sure when you're picking a particular major vendor in something like this. is that I'm trying to unshare this here. There we go. That's better. It is to be sure that they can provide the resources that you're going to need in order to support the facility. Some will offer long-term commitments to training, refresher courses and things like that, and others won't. They just don't have the bandwidth to do it. We offer a number of different, our company offers a lot of different training programs. I officially take on that role inside the company right now to train our own folks. The whole IP showcase situation came out of me walking into, at that time, Tektronix at NAB and saying, how do you go about training your people to go out and help support your products in the field? And the senior vice president at Tektronix turned the question right around to me and said, how do you guys do it? And I told him, I said, in all candor, we don't. We started out in this thing with participation in standards work. And then we got this job to relocate the AP from Midtown Manhattan to the financial district. And they wanted to go 2110, although 2110 wasn't even finished yet. We had to go 2022-6. So we started training our people immediately. And it was that partnership that I struck up on behalf of Diversified with Tektronix that began this whole IP Roadshow kit. And unfortunately, COVID killed that shortly after I came back from Japan and did Japan and Korea and did almost a week and a half of training for in Japanese and in Korean, neither of which I speak that language enough to get by with. We use translators. So there's all sorts of avenues. SMPTE is a very good resource for it, but they're not the only resource. And if you have concern or you're thinking about going down this path, reach out to me. I can help you.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Oh.
Hey, great presentation. Could you say a little bit more about the evaluation of various products you were considering for their security level, and how important was that ultimately in deciding who got picked, who got purchased? Thanks.
Well, another good question and a complicated one. Microsoft has a policy that anything that has the word software connected with it must go through their security systems and clearance houses. Now, we told every vendor that participated in this that we don't know what that means to you and what complications they're getting into, but if you want to sell your product in this project, be prepared for that. So we knew that was coming. We didn't have any trouble with anybody security-wise. Again, the IT department is a separate functional department inside of Microsoft Production Studios. The production folks do production, and all of the management, the entire network is managed by well-qualified, but separate at arm's length, independent folks. So we don't really know to what depth they did their security evaluations. But I will say this, I, as a part of the Galaxy team for ABC News, which is moving all of the facilities in New York City to a new building in Midtown Manhattan, which have been involved in for over 2.5 years already, and we still have 2.5 more years to go, probably. There is extensive security concerns there and evaluations and processes, to the point that they aren't just going to take your word for it. They want to see it. So anybody who's providing a gear in this particular situation has to have their gear put into a POC where it's run through the rigors. So, I mean, a lot of this, every entity has their approaches in a different way. There's fortunately, SMPTE has been working on procedures for how to ensure that 2059, which is PTP, is secure. And there's recently some publications through SMPTE that are available that describe what to look for and so forth. You'd be surprised how much of it is common sense in reality. And if you have a decent experience in doing IP security from a back office standpoint, most of those things will apply to media. And the great thing about it is most of this media doesn't go out and touch the internet anyway. Some of the control and management portions of it were, but you know, that's no different than dealing with internet browsers and things like that. So it's not as difficult as you think if you, again, apply common sense and take the techniques that you do for a normal back office implementation. That makes sense?
Yep. You got a thumbs up from Sean there. Any other questions? Well, I'd like to take the time to thank Karl for putting together the presentation for us and presenting it with all of the trials and tribulations we had getting the thing going. And I'll catch you at the next bar list at Bar Line, and I'll buy you a beverage.
We'll do that. I'll take you up on it.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Barry.
Karl.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
One more thing I must say, I'll be very remiss in not thanking Ramona for allowing us to put this thing together in here. She's been incredibly helpful, as she always is, and we owe you a debt of gratitude. And with that, we can retire.
Mhm.